thank you all very much for coming out today. I'll introduce myself. I'm Zachariah Ralph. I'm representative for Hartland, Windsor, and West Windsor. And today, this is a public discussion about Senate Bill 169. And the objective of this discussion is to hear from you, your comments, your questions, your concerns, and for us to walk you through the bill as well, so that there is, so we all understand what the bill is, so we're going to start off with just setting some ground rules, just to make sure that we are having a discussion that's productive, and it's not super political. And then we will actually walk through the legislation itself, and that's when we'll open up to questions and comments, when we love to hear from you. And then hopefully we'll all go home happy. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm John Bartholomew. I think all of you know me. I'm the other representative from our district. And like Zach said, I mean, mostly it's to hear from you. This is in the House. The House Judiciary Committee is taking it up. And we don't know how it's going to come out of that committee, but it'll probably be on the floor pretty soon. So yeah, we want to hear from Heartlanders. There have been public hearings at the State House, but that's not easy for everyone to get to. We want to hear from our constituents.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a good point, John. The bill we're looking at right now is the way it came out of the Senate. So it's in committee right now, which means there could potentially be some adjustments to the bill. So what we're looking at right now is what's coming out of the Senate. It is not necessarily what will come to the floor.
Senator Nitka going to be here? I know she's on Judiciary.
Senator Nitka is on Judiciary in the Senate, and we invited the senators to come. They all had prior engagements and unfortunately could not join us today, but they all wished they could be here for what we hope to be a very fun, lively discussion. So just that warning that what we're looking at today is what's coming to the House, what came out of the Senate, but is not necessarily what will come to the House floor. We have heard some rumblings of potentially.
Before we forget, though, what used to be Heartland Community Connections, the monthly breakfasts at Damon Hall, it's now called something else. I think just Heartland
Community Connections.
But in any case, next week, next Saturday morning, is going to be the legislative update, and I believe all three senators and both of us are planning to be there. So yes, it's not about guns, particularly just general stuff, questions and what's going on in both the House and the Senate. So if you're interested in that, great breakfast and a chance to hear from everybody.
All right, so just wanted to start off with some ground rules to make sure that, and like for everybody to agree on the ground rules as well, just to make sure that we are having a productive discussion, and making sure that we are doing our best to keep emotions out of this. John and I can learn a lot from you. That's why we're here today, and we want to make sure that we are putting a framework in place that we can actually learn from you. So I have a list of goals that we could potentially, ground rules that we could potentially use. But I wanted to hear from other folks first to see if there was anything you wanted to make sure that was done in a particular way today. Any suggestions?
Just a simple one. If folks would just introduce themselves, like I'm Chris Nickenberg, but if folks would just introduce themselves before they speak, it might help those of us who might not know everybody else.
So introduce, just name, or do you think what town you're from?
Anyone here who's not from Heartland? Oh, that's simple.
Ariel, you had one you wanted to add?
Yeah. I was thinking that it would be good for statements to be as emotion neutral as possible, not to have a whole lot of negative or positive or strong emotion in any direction, because maybe that will help us just have a really civil, calm, respectful, listening to each other kind of conversation.
Okay, so what would be a good way of saying that?
Speak calmly.
Speak calmly. Speak calmly, and to the content, maybe.
Okay.
Speak calmly.
Well, and I think I would propose one, and that is that we should be respectful. If someone is speaking and you don't agree with what they're saying, let them speak, let them have their say, and just be respectful of each other. Does that, everyone think that's a reasonable Okay, I mean, I think that may be the most important one.
Yes, respectful. Let everybody finish. Finish. And one rule that I saw was speak to the bill and not to the person. So everybody's going to have different opinions here. That's okay. That's what makes our system stronger. But let's speak to the actual legislation and not go after individuals. There's one that I saw. Any other suggestions? Are people raising their hand?
Nope, I think they're being quiet. So,
Okay.
so does that make sense to everyone? Okay.
Just, is there anybody that's opposed to these ground rules? Anything in particular?
I'm just shocked you think you have to put them up there.
I think it's important, but yeah, I think this might as well put it out there so that we don't have any confusion later on. But that's a good point. We are all community members, right?
Do we have a copy of the bill? Do you have a copy of the bill?
I'm going to. So you can find.
If you've got an electronic device, you can pull it up pretty easily. But we didn't bring copies.
It's
up here,
not.
though. We're going to go through it.
So, without further ado, if there's no other issues, is everybody in agreement with the rules that we have on the board?
Yep.
Yes.
I just want to see what they are. I got here late.
Oh, that's okay. So what we have is introduce yourself, speak calmly, and then I crossed out a bunch of stuff, but be respectful and let everybody finish. Speak to the bill and not to the person. Pretty straightforward. Oops. That's how we see the bill, so that's interesting. So this is Senate Bill 169. Excuse me. These are my fun mushroom pictures.
Fungus porn.
All right, so I'm just going to walk through the bill. This is so what we're looking at right now. This is the official version, and anything that's not underlined means that it is existing law already. So it might relate to some gun legislation last year. Anything that you see underlined means that it is new language, and anything that you see crossed out means that it has been taken out. In some cases, it's been taken out and moved, but we're just going to, it's only 6 pages, so it's actually not super dense. And just so everybody knows, when John and I are in committees and we are hearing about bills, legal counsel, our lawyers essentially, walk through every bill with us, like this, with us just like this. So we want to give you that same opportunity. So this is the purpose of the bill. This bill proposes several procedures related to firearms. It's an act related to firearm procedures. So large capacity ammunition feeding devices. This was passed last year, which is why none of this language is underlined. The red language here, the red lines, is what has been crossed out, which is no longer part of the bill, and most of it has just been clarified in different language. So as we go down to page 2, we can see that this section right here, this is the entirety of the stuff that's crossed out with the new sections. And as you see, the underlined section is what has been added. So I'll read this section for folks that can't see it. The prohibition on possession of large capacity ammunition feeding devices established by subsection A of this section shall not apply to large capacity ammunition feeding devices lawfully possessed on or before the effective date of this exception. And then this is the language that was added. And again, this has to do with the exceptions to the prohibition of large capacity magazines. So this, or to the transfer by a Vermont resident of a lawfully possessed large capacity ammunition feeding device from one immediately family member to another immediate family member by a lawfully executed will. B, as used in this subsection, immediate family means and has the same meaning as subsection 4019A of this title. What this is saying is that this is allowing for the transfer of large capacity magazines between immediate family members. Where it's illegal elsewhere, this is allowing for that. If you currently have a large capacity magazine, you can transfer it between your immediate family. So it's adding that language. And also, if people have questions while we're going through it, feel free.
Further on, you're going to see that the definition of immediate family member is expanded in this.
Yes. So there's quite a few. Yeah, Laura.
It says in the will, so it's only upon death, or is there transfer allowed
I think this one might be on death.
at other times?
By a family executed, by a lawfully executed will.
Or maybe wills are more than I think they are, and I'm just...
No, I think you're right. That's by a lawfully executed will, or the transfer by a Vermont resident of a lawfully pleasant. That's from one immediate family to another immediate family member by a lawfully executed will. That's correct. Yes. So it can be transferred via will after you die. Or
I'm not actually sure about that, because the notes I got from a member of the Judiciary Committee said transfer between family members is okay. So I'm not
A will might not just be when you die. It may just be a will, which I don't know the legal definition of, which is why I've asked the question.
Well, John, if you're saying it's okay to transfer between family members when they're alive, that's what you just said?
I think that's what it means, but I mean, neither of us are on the Judiciary Committee. We didn't hear all the testimony, but the information, it might be through a will, but I believe that I think there's a good chance that it relates to any transfer between immediate family members, which is defined further down.
so that's a good question.
Isn't there a distinction between this section, which has to do with the high-capacity feeding devices, and subsequent portion of the bill, which has to do with transfer within the immediate family of various firearms without background check? Did I read it right?
Yes.
Further down where they define extended family, I thought that had to do with background.
And so, yeah, the background check has to do with transfer of firearms. This is in regards to ammunition,
Only the ammunition.
high-capacity ammunition. So I'm going to, that's a good question, Laurel, about whether it's just for the will, because my understanding was that it was between all family members, but based on this language, it looks like it might be the will, but we need some clarification on that.
You could make some complaints.
Yeah.
There's nothing in there, you can be correct that it's between any family member, but this is saying specifically under this condition, between anybody who is legally converted. And by saying it's by will, assuming that will means last will and testament, it's restricting it to that and not allowing it by other means or at other times.
It's expanding on the current exemptions. Or is adding it to it exactly. But yes, I believe that's the case. We'll go down a little bit further and see if it adds to it. But I believe that's the case.
So what this is a weakening of current law.
That's one way of looking at it. You could say that. I think that there's probably some reasoning behind it, and I think that a lot of that's one way of looking at it. I would say that. So this, going into section B here, this section was crossed out, as you can see. This is current existing law when transferred to so this is one of the exemptions. So remember I was saying it was expanding on it. So one of the exemptions is transferred to or possessed by law enforcement officer or to a law enforcement officer certified as a law enforcement officer by the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council pursuant 20 VSA 2358 for legitimate law enforcement purposes, whether the office is on or off duty. So that one of the exemptions is you can transfer between law officers. And then it adds the or, see the underline there, and it adds another section. Actually, it crosses out this section and clarifies it so that it now says, or possessed by an out-of-state law enforcement officer in Vermont for legitimate law enforcement purposes. So it adds, it just clarifies this language. So if a large capacity magazine is possessed by an out-of-state law enforcement officer in Vermont, it can be transferred to a law enforcement officer in Vermont for law enforcement purposes. So it's specifically for law enforcement purposes. This is minor changes, and perhaps folks that attend gun shows can be more, shooting events can maybe explain to me what the difference is here. But one of the exemptions as well is that if a large capacity magazine is transported by a resident of another state into the state for the exclusive purpose of use in what used to be established but now has been changed to organized shooting competition if the device is lawfully possessed under the law of another state. So what this means is if we have a shooting event, then you are, and somebody is coming from out of state, they can bring their large capacity magazine into the state with them as long as it's obtained lawfully. Can somebody help me understand the difference between an established and an organized shooting?
They probably meant so that you could create new ones in the future. Okay. They used organized as a more accurate
established
term.
Sounds like it's pre-existing,
right?
Okay.
Which would preclude you from.
Would be like making it sound like a
you could
grandfather
argue that you
clause.
can't create a new shooting competition, and
Okay.
that's how I interpret it.
And how organized does the competition have to be? Can it just be your brother says, I bet I can shoot better than you?
It's one of those fun legal terms, which is broadly defined, and that is one of those things that might be sort of defined later in the courts, unless John has some more insight onto that.
That sounds like one of my interrogation questions when the bill comes up, because sometimes these terms are very clearly defined in statute in the definition section, and this one is not. So it's a good question.
It's a good question. And then another exemption was added so possessed at and used at an organized shooting competition if the device was lawfully possessed on or before October 2018. So this is the point of this section here, is to establish when used in an organized shooting competition if the device was lawfully. So if you bought your large capacity magazine before October 2018, that would be considered lawful. If it's after that, then it would be not lawful. So it's it's crossing out one of the additions, April 11th, and changing it to October 1st, 2018.
Do you have any idea why that there is a date and why that one was picked?
Nope. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly why that date was chosen. It might have to do with just the implementation of the law and giving ourselves more time, essentially. But this is retroactive, so no, I'm not entirely sure.
It just had to do when the bill was passed and when the restriction for high-capacity magazines went into effect, which was about a little more than a year ago, I think.
Yeah. Wesley?
It gave retailers a chance to sell what they had in inventory so that it didn't have an adverse effect on business in the state. As much of an adverse effect.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. That makes sense. So it gives our retailers a more of a chance to get rid of their inventory before the law went into
related
effect.
to when the law went into effect, and like Wes said, when leaving the merchants opportunity to sell inventory. For the sake of making this make sense, can we jump ahead to section 6 and then come back? Just because there's a repeal in here that relates to the high-capacity magazines and the shooting competitions, and that is there was the exception was put into law, and this is partly because of Wes Rainey. He had communicated with me quite a bit about the possible impact on people coming into the state specifically for shooting competitions and losing that revenue both for individuals and for the state. So that's why the exception went in there, but there was a date. Where is it?
A sunset clause, essentially.
Yeah, there was a sunset to that exception, and that in this bill is being repealed. So there won't be a sunset for that ability to bring in the capacity magazines for these shooting competitions. That's being repealed in the Senate version of the law. So
I'm just slightly confused with what the sunset means. So the net effect of all this would mean if the repeal goes through, that what would happen? That you could not bring in large capacity magazines for shooting competition?
My understanding is that there was a sunset where after that date you could no longer bring in the high capacity magazines for a shooting competition. the sunset being repealed, meaning that there isn't an end date when you can no longer bring them in.
So if I understand it, it means if you've lawfully purchased a high-capacity magazine elsewhere at any date, then you can come and bring it to an organized shooting competition. Did I get that right?
Before October.
Yes, but you can't by law bring in the high-capacity mag. If you live out in Vermont, you can't import them from out of state and just keep them because you want to own them. That doesn't exempt that. It's just bringing them in for a shooting competition.
Just for the shooting competition.
And as it currently stands, that has ended already, I believe.
What's that?
It has already sunsetted, but this bill would extend it.
Get rid of the sunset.
Basically, nobody from New Hampshire and Maine and stuff would really want to come to a shooting competition in Vermont because they wouldn't have the equipment to be legal under our law. So that's why they would want to do that.
Okay, so I think it makes more sense to look at that now, but you can go back to where we were.
This is only in reference to high-capacity devices, right?
That's
For
correct.
the shooting competition.
At competitions, yeah.
So as we talked about before, this section, Section 2, refers to firearm transfers and background checks. And as we mentioned before, as John mentioned, that we define immediate family to now include parent in-laws, sibling in-laws, aunt, uncle, niece, and nephew, in addition to child, stepchild, sibling, stepchild, sibling, grandparent, step-grandparent, child, step-grandchild, great-grandparent, step-great-grandparent, great-grandchild, and step-great-grandchild. So it adds and expands on what immediate family is, so it's very clear who can have these large capacity magazines transferred to in a lawfully executed will. So this is all new, which is why you're seeing it underlined. This is Section 3, and it's handgun transfers and waiting periods. And I will just, the primary intent of this is to add a 24-hour waiting period for the purchase of handguns. So I will read it for you. A person shall not transfer a handgun to another person until 24 hours after the completion of the background check required by 18 U.S.C. 922T or Section 419 of this title. That's established law about background checks, those numbers. B, a person who transfers a handgun to another person in violation of subsection of A of this section shall be imprisoned not more than 1 year or fined not more than $500 or both. Section C, this section shall not apply to a handgun transfer that does not require a background check under 18 U.S.C. 922T or Section 419 of this title. So again, any transfer of a handgun is required now to have a 24-hour background check, and that it establishes what the fines and the punishments will be if you do this unlawfully. I am not familiar enough with 18 U.S.C. 922T or Section 419 to know what a handgun transfer is that does not require a background check. So I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if anybody else is familiar with what the circumstances would be. Wesley?
Probably under immediate family.
Immediate family stuff.
And it's wanted to correct you. It's not a 24-hour background check. It's just 24 hours after a background check. So the background check is still the same background check.
Background check
performed by the National Institute of Criminal Statistics. And it's instant, essentially. Sometimes it can get delayed. Sometimes it actually can take days if people have similar social security numbers or names or date of birth to questionable people. But generally, it's the kind of thing where they call the FBI, give them the information, and then and they get a reference number, and they can get the information in just a few minutes.
Okay, so
Questions
it's
in the back here.
24 hours after the completion of the background check. So even if the background check takes a couple days, then you still have to wait 24 hours after the background check was completed. David?
I believe it also runs through NCIC, which is the National Criminal Information Center. And usually that's fairly, by the way, if anyone doesn't know, I was a police officer in the state for 20 years, so I'm familiar with it. Usually it's pretty quick, thanks to modern computer. Mr. Rainey, I don't know if you've encountered any real delays, but...
Not personally, but I've heard of it.
No, I mean in your experience with, yeah. So it shouldn't be too long, but nobody can guarantee that.
Phil?
Zach, on the background check, it's I'm sitting here assuming that it's the buyer, but is it a two-way check? The seller and the buyers are checked for background?
Only FFLs can perform the background checks.
So,
Federal firearms license holders are the only ones that can perform the background checks.
yeah.
So they don't need to be background checked because they've already undergone extensive checks to have a federal firearms license.
So, Phil, was your question about, so say you have the firearm and you want to sell it to somebody else, you're asking if both the seller and the buyer get background checks?
Yeah.
The seller, because the seller can't perform a background check, so they'd have to go to a federal firearms license holder to perform the background check.
All right.
So no, only the person that's receiving the firearm is getting background check.
Okay.
Because the person that's selling it actually doesn't have access to it. It has to be performed at a.
But they wouldn't. The person selling it wouldn't necessarily have a background check done on them in the instance of selling.
No.
So what about, like, if you have personally, like, say, your family, you have these firearms, that you want to sell personally, do you have to then, is it saying that you have to transfer it to a place that they sell guns?
Under current Vermont law, you have to go to a federal firearms license holder and they have to perform background checks.
So, like, say if you,
as of last year.
And that's partly if the gun were traced back to you and and you sold it and it was used for a crime and you hadn't met the terms of that, I guess you could be liable for criminal action, not criminal action, but there's a liability for you as the seller if you haven't completed that step. So to sell a gun to me, for example, we're not related. So we'd have to go to a gun shop where there's a license and they would do a background check on me before you could sell it to me.
Jerry,
That's
did you
how I
have a
understand.
Cost for that,
It varies anywhere from $25 to $50 per gun.
per gun?
Yeah.
Jerry, you had a question?
Yes, does transfer mean transfer of ownership? Suppose I wanted to lease you a gun for 99 years.
I think that's a transfer.
That's a transfer?
And probably to give it to me is a transfer.
Possession is a key word in there, right?
Yeah.
So even if somebody wanted to borrow it, for example?
We're not attorneys.
Right.
So,
And that's why I defer to folks that know more about the background check system, about how that works if somebody wants to, say, let their friend borrow it.
That's one of the problems that pro-gun people had with the bills that were passed last year, or primarily S55 with the universal background checks, because it was unclear whether if you handed your gun to somebody while hunting, if that constitutes a transfer, or if you're at the shooting range and you let somebody use it, or if you loan one to your brother for the season or something like that.
yes.
Great question, Jerry. I will we'll look at some clarification on that, and seems like that there is some.
In the headline, this is limited to handguns. Is there a reason why long guns are not being controlled, not suggesting control in a similar manner?
You're talking about the sale?
They were initially.
And there, I think, will probably be an amendment in House Judiciary to include long guns. And they're trying to, take the temperature of House members to see how that would fly. But now keep in mind, the idea of this is not to control access to guns. That is not the intent whatsoever, and it's important to make this. And I actually, maybe later I'll read some information, but this is a suicide issue, and it relates to the fact that many suicides are done with guns, and that if someone decides they want to commit suicide and they have immediate access to a gun, it's probably going to be lethal. And there are data that show that many, many suicides, people who contemplate suicide will often act impulsively, and if they are thwarted in that first attempt, a huge percentage of them don't go on to commit suicide. So the point of this is not to restrict access to guns, it's to address public safety and try to deal with this issue of using guns for suicide. So the question comes, if I already have guns, I'm not going to go buy one if I want to commit suicide, right? But if I don't have a gun, am I going to go buy a handgun or a long gun? Well, I would think I'd probably buy a handgun. But if I go in and they say, well, you can't buy a handgun, there's a waiting period, am I going to say, well, I won't commit suicide today, or will I buy a long gun? So it's kind of like, does it make sense to exclude one or the other?
And we can talk more about the intent of the bill afterwards.
Yep.
Let's just get through the bill. I did see, Kurt, you had a question, though?
You answered it, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. So, any other questions about the
but I also wanted to add the 24 hours. There was also discussion of making it 72 hours. And because the idea is not to control access to guns, one of the issues becomes gun shows. It may only be 2 or 3 days long. So if you want to buy a gun at a gun at a gun show, it's not, the idea isn't that you can't do that. It means you may have to come back the next day to pick it up. You have to wait 24 hours. But it doesn't preclude sales at gun shows. That's one of the reasons it went to 24 hours instead of 72. It's not intended to restrict access to guns. That's not the intent of this bill.
All right, so Section 4 is the procedure. Again, this section here, except otherwise specified, proceeding commenced under this subchapter shall be in accordance with the Vermont rules for family proceedings and shall be in addition to any other available civil or criminal remedies. So this was existing. The new languages is, again, the underlined portion here. D, for the purposes of a petition filed pursuant to this subchapter, a health care provider may notify a law enforcement officer when the provider believes in good faith that disclosure of the information is necessary to prevent or lessen serious and imminent threat to the health or safety of a person or the public. So again, they're disclosing information. A healthcare provider is disclosing information if they think it is necessary to prevent or lessen a serious and imminent threat to the health or safety of a person or the public. Section 2 here, as used in this section.
On that?
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Yeah, go ahead. And say your name for us.
It says may notify. It does say doesn't say shall notify.
That's correct.
Was that on purpose?
Yes, it is,
because that's arbitrary.
It's at the discretion of the healthcare provider, and it's based on good faith. We can't say for certain what is that thing that's going to spark our spidey senses to say, well, I think this person is going to do something violent. We leave it into the hands of our healthcare providers to determine whether, to leave it to their judgment, whether this is something they need to do. But the shall would imply that if they did not do it, they would also be liable and also would potentially be prosecuted by the law. So the may is optional. It's one of those fun things about writing law. Nice observation. So, as used, again, the underlined portion is new. As used in this subsection, a healthcare provider has the same meaning as in 18 VSA. It's just a definition of what a healthcare provider, and then it goes into a little bit about the definitions of what we saw above. Clarification language B, necessary to prevent or lessen a serious and imminent threat to the health or safety of a person or the public includes circumstances when a healthcare provider reasonably believes the patient poses an extreme risk of causing harm to himself or herself or another person by purchasing, possessing, or receiving a dangerous weapon, or by having a dangerous weapon within his or her custody. So it gives a little bit more explanation of what they might be looking for. Any questions about that section? This is also this is about reporting. This is for the legislature. Yeah, go ahead, Laurel.
In the previous section, maybe we haven't gotten to it yet, but what happens if they report, and when would they report, and where would those names go? I guess maybe that's coming further on down, but...
It is not, as far as I know. I don't believe that is, it determines what the process is for that. I believe there is a process through with law enforcement that when they receive some sort of threat or concern, that they would have some sort of response. I'm not sure what that would be or what that procedure would be. I'm not sure if David might have more insight into that.
It doesn't hang in limbo. when you receive a complaint, you must bring that complaint to fruition. Whether that could be, we don't find a substantial reason or a strong enough reason, or yeah, we're concerned too. And that report is usually somehow or other brought back to the complainant. If it's under investigation, there's some things you can't even bring back to the complainant, but you don't leave the complainant hanging in limbo. Nor, as a matter of fact, do you leave the public in limbo if they don't know about it. We had one case you've all read about out of Orange County, the Zantop murders. One of the young men who was involved in the killing. I don't want to go into that, but there should have been more follow-up on the suspicious activity of that young man.
It raises all sorts of questions, but let's go on.
But I think in terms of for a healthcare provider, if they think someone is high risk for suicide, they're going to go to, they have to actually send them to the emergency room for evaluation, and at that point, I'm sure they would contact law enforcement.
And so that sounds like a health services sort of procedure, which...
Just wondering how this adds to the existing procedures, which is what she just... I don't...
My guess is that, and I cannot make a judgment about why this language was added. I think there was initially a bill which had... this is a combination of 2 or 3 bills. S-169 is a combination of 2 or 3 bills. And initially there was some legislation that suggested that if, in the case of where somebody has domestic violence or has a history of suicide, that law enforcement would be allowed to remove firearms or they wouldn't be able to purchase them. That might be a very poor summary, I'm not sure. So I believe that this is the language that came out of that.
Okay, that explains a lot.
The extreme risk protection order, that's something that was in the bill last year. And it might be helpful if I just read this bit I got from a colleague on judiciary that might explain it better than I can.
But that's been stricken from it, so it doesn't really matter at this point.
No, it's not stricken.
Oh, okay.
So the bill also modifies, this bill also modifies Vermont's extreme risk protection order statute that was passed in Act 97 last year. Act 97 established a procedure for the state's attorney or the attorney general to obtain a court order called an extreme risk protection order that temporarily prohibits a person from possessing a dangerous weapon if the court finds that the person's possession of the weapon poses an extreme risk of harm to the person or to other people. So that's what we did last year. Court order can say you're a danger and you, for a limited amount of time, you can't have guns.
What's the burden of proof, John?
I don't know. You'd have to ask an attorney. But that's pretty much existing law. Yeah. So that's what I'm told. So then it goes on to say S-169 clarifies that a healthcare provider may seek one of these orders without violating privacy provisions of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996.
I think that's key.
That's what this is doing.
Yeah, it's allowing the health people to notify the police because otherwise they might be
do something.
privacy.
There's a possibility here.
Okay. You have HIPAA, which I think that's what Kurt's talking about.
Yeah, that's what John
override
said.
HIPAA.
Yeah. And it goes on to say there's a report
what I was trying
because
to
the legislature wants to know
That makes sense.
how often these are happening. What's the effect of this? Is it having a positive or negative effect? Is the law that got enacted, is it doing what it's supposed to or not? And that's really, I believe that's why this report is put in here, this language about a report.
Wesley, your question about burden of proof,
Yeah.
can you tell me more about that?
So there's a judicial procedure for removing firearms from somebody. So there's a burden of proof that was initially in the bill, and I believe that the burden of proof was decreased by the time that it passed.
Okay.
So, beyond a reasonable doubt is a burden of proof.
Mm-hmm.
Preponderance of evidence is a burden, as a lesser burden of proof. And then, like, one of the lowest burdens of proof is like a reasonable. What is it? It's like basically a reasonable person would believe that it's plausible or something like that. That's not the exact language, but
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I always appreciate it.
so to remove Bill of Rights from people should be a fairly high burden of proof, in my opinion.
Okay.
But keep in mind, the only thing this bill is proposing to change is this stuff about the healthcare provider.
Right. And there's also,
And the reporting requirement.
I don't want to say extrajudicial, but there's already procedures in place in the healthcare industry and in law enforcement that can deal with this without, with them reporting. They can then, hospitals know what to do with people that are suicidal. Police perform health and welfare checks on people on a regular basis. So there's other stuff in place beyond extreme risk protection orders that this empowers.
Okay. Is there, based on what you just said, this would look like it's a little bit redundant, perhaps? Or is it covering something else?
Maybe not if HIPAA would have prevented it.
Okay. So it does expand that so that...
Although if HIPAA is a federal thing, I don't really see how
we could supersede HIPAA. It's a good question for the floor.
I kind of doubt it does. I think that HIPAA probably allows for reporting suicides, like risk.
For folks that don't know what HIPAA is, anybody have a good definition of HIPAA?
Health information, maybe, Mr. I don't remember.
Protection Act. It's just privacy, basically, for between medical providers and patients.
All right, so we're right at the end of the bill. Like I said, this was relatively short. We like to joke and say things are simple in the State House. They never are. This is annual reporting, Office of Court Administrator and Agency of Human Services. A lot of the times this is just to determine how effective these bills were, to see if we need to improve on them. So on or before September 1st, 2019, and annually thereafter, the court administrator, with the assistance of the Agency of Human Services, shall report data on the use of the extreme risk protection orders during the previous year to the Senate and House Committees on Judiciary. The reports required by this section shall include the following data for the previous year. 1. The number of extreme risk protection order petitions filed and the number of orders issued. 2. Geographical data indicating the county where the petition was filed. And 3. Follow-up information describing whether the order was renewed or terminated pursuant section 4055 of this title, and whether the subject of the order was charged with violating it under the section 4058 of this title. C. The Agency of Human Services shall include in the reports required by this section an analysis of the impact of extreme risk prevention orders on Vermont suicide rates, including any relevant data relied on or utilized by the agency for purposes of providing the information required by 2017 Acts and Resolves number 34, an act relating to the evaluation of suicide profiles. And 6 is the repeal, which John already talked about, and the effective date, which is also important, is that this shall take effect on passage, so no delay. So that's the bill. Pretty simple. Yeah.
Quick question, if that little rider about evaluation of the bill was in this bill, was there a rider like that in the bill that was passed last year as well, to evaluate the effect of the extreme risk?
I don't remember one, and I don't see any language struck out to suggest that it's being changed. So it looks like
I was just curious if any data was collected.
Sometimes it's difficult in bills because if nothing's changed, it may not appear, and there could be a whole section that deals with something. But I don't think so.
My question was, is there any data, it's been roughly a year since the other bill was passed or not like that, to know what the effect has been thus far?
I don't know.
You know, I don't know.
That's a good question to ask.
It's been used once as far as I know.
The point of this extreme risk protection is not to restrict access to guns again, but to ensure public safety. That's why that's there. So it makes a lot of sense to be getting information back from the judiciary to see the effect, to make sure that it's doing what is intended rather than having unintended consequences.
Wesley, you said you heard of one example, and where could we find that information?
Well, it's in the news because it's kind of been a significant case. It was the impetus for all of the laws passed last year. But the kid that had planned the school shooting, firearms were taken from his uncle.
Okay.
Because he couldn't guarantee that the kid hadn't made copies of the keys or had combination to the safe and stuff.
Okay. It's a good question. I'll ask. We can run these questions by judiciary or ask it on the floor to find out if there was some testimony taken on that to determine how effective the law has been thus far. That's a good question. So at this point, I want to give John and I will speak briefly about maybe the intention of the bill, and if you want to say your thoughts and views on it, and then we can love to open it up to questions and comments.
Well, I'm mostly here to, I've kind of gone over what I believe the intent of the bill is as we went through it. So I really want to hear what people think. We've got some good questions that came forward that we need to explore further. But at this point, I don't have anything to add.
Cool. Yeah, I think as you saw, the looks like there's some on both sides, clarifying, providing more exemptions for the 30-round magazine clips, and then there's also this 24-hour waiting period. I think as it is, it's not a huge change to our law, and as it's written now, I feel that I would be able to support it, but certainly hear some concerns and some questions, and I'd like to clarify those as well, so that we can make sure we make this bill absolutely as strong as possible. So with that, let's open it up to questions and comments, concerns.
I'd just like to address.
And just a reminder, introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'll stand up. So yeah, my name is Wes Rainey. I'm from Hartland. The gun show thing, not necessarily. I don't think it's the most important aspect of this debate, but I just wanted to clear that up for people that are unfamiliar. Regardless of what you think about gun shows, all gun shows in Vermont have to now perform background checks, and even before last year's laws went into effect, they did. In Vermont, it happened to be that all of the gun shows performed background checks. This law would essentially eliminate that industry, and it would most adversely affect lower income and people that are less informed about gun laws. This is going to serve as just one more hoop to jump through. But the reason it would get rid of gun shows is because, like you said, the gun show is basically a one-time thing. You go there. There's a lot of different federal firearms license holders in one building selling a lot of different guns, so you have a chance to shop around, perform a background check, get the gun. Now, if you have to drive there twice, if you've driven several hours or something, that makes that much less convenient. Or if you're there, they're usually only 2 days, and if you're there on the second day, then you can't do it. Maybe you'll have to drive to the thing. So there's promotion companies involved in putting on the gun shows. There's a lot of federal firearms license holders who their only or primary business is gun shows. So this would really quash all that. There would be no point of doing them. They would just be like literally a show. It'd be like a museum. There wouldn't be a lot of sales being able to happen. You just go and look, unless the people you're purchasing from happen to be geographically convenient for you to go to.
What percentage of gun sales occur in gun shows in the state?
Probably a pretty small percentage.
So it's not an enormous impact on the sale of guns?
Well, for the people whose primary business is that.
Yes, but in terms of the overall percentage of gun sales?
Yeah, probably. Vermont, is a relatively small population, but we have like 620,000 people or 640,000 or something like that. And gun shows, there's usually, I think like 10 a year or something.
There's not many
around the state. So, and some of them are fairly well attended. There's some pretty large ones, but I don't think there's any data on. I don't have any numbers to actually know what percentage of sales.
I had a quick.
Yeah.
Did you say that? I just wanted to. It was a clarifying question. So, did you say that because the background checks already exist, that mostly it's misinformation that will prevent people from coming to the gun shows because they think it's
not gun shows, but buying a gun, now there's one more hoop involved, and then not having a gun show limits a lot, limits their ability. There's no reason to really go to a gun show and buy a gun if there's a 24-hour waiting period, so you can't actually get it. You gotta just leave and then go back, or then try to coordinate with wherever that FFL is and get to them, and they might be not convenient to you.
Okay.
But regardless of whether you like gun shows or not, I'm saying that this a 72-hour one would absolutely make them pointless, and this makes them very irrelevant.
I guess the point of including gun shows is supposedly to prevent people who are thinking about suicide getting a gun, because that seems kind of unlikely that, you know, if they're going to have to wait for the gun show to come to their neighborhood, they're already going to have to wait for more than 24 hours. So if it's kind of balancing the gun show viability
Hold
against
on, let
suicide,
Laurel finish.
I don't know if it makes sense. If there's another reason for limiting stuff that happens at gun shows, I'm not familiar enough with the legislation, but I'm just putting that out.
So I don't think it's the intent of the legislation to target gun shows. It just
Right, no,
happens to, because of the way that they work, it just,
Unintended consequences,
because they happen in a small window,
Yeah,
it just happens to affect
but
them.
it doesn't make
But you're
sense for
right.
suicide prevention.
You're right in that your suicide urge would have to coincide with a gun show for that to really.
So I did want to follow up with a question, if I may, and that is exactly what was just brought up. If I'm contemplating suicide, I'm probably not going to wait for the next gun show.
Right.
So the intent in my mind, as I said before, is a suicide prevention rather than restricting gun sales. So I was considering an amendment to exclude gun shows. One concern I have, and maybe you can help me answer that, is what kind of loopholes would that open if we went down that path?
I mean, loopholes are either complying with the law or not complying with the law. So I don't really like the term loophole.
Well, but you know what I mean.
I'm not in favor of the waiting period at all. So I mean, if you're gonna, what's the point of? But if you do think it's a good idea and you can make that argument, why make exemptions? That's not a consistently logical train of thought. Do you understand what I'm saying? If you think that waiting periods are going to help with suicide prevention, don't have any exemptions to the waiting periods. That's the consistent line of thought.
Okay.
I don't think that they will.
Up.
I don't think that they will impact suicide rates.
You know who's first?
Chris Niffenberg. I'm curious, are there other states that do have a 24-hour waiting period? Or are there any other states that have that already?
There's a bunch of different waiting periods in different states.
And do we have a sense of what the impact has been on gun shows?
On gun shows?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't have any data on
The
this.
reason I was wondering is I think you were saying that if you do that, it's going to kind of kill it for the smaller gun shows if they have to wait the 24-hour time. And I was just curious about what's happened in other places where they have had to do that. Did it have that effect?
I think William in the back might have a response for you. Bob, excuse me.
That's all right. There are 10 states and Washington, D.C. that have waiting periods. And as Wesley said, there's different kinds. California has a 10-day waiting period. They've had, as recently as 2016, record firearm sales there. And they still continue to have gun shows. None of the states that have had waiting periods have had put gun shows out of business. They're still there. So to say that a waiting period is going to impose such a hardship that gun shows will no longer exist is really an unfair characterization of how it's played out.
Do you know how logistically they do that with a waiting period?
I'm sorry?
Do you know logistically how they do that?
I don't know exactly, but I think there's ways you could work out with the third party, putting a deposit on it and having it mailed to you. I mean, some
No,
sales
that's absolutely not possible.
can't be done.
No.
Okay, well, I haven't done it, so I don't know the effect. But as I say, the gun shows still exist in those 10 other states.
Still a lot of hands.
Yeah, David Baldwin. After following your logic, Wesley, about the waiting period affecting the gun shows, and you say that most gun shows are for a couple of days.
Weekend usually.
Yeah.
And
So-
just real quick, we would ask that you address the bill and not the person. So
Oh,
address
okay.
the
I'm
content.
Just he had a specific question.
No, that's fine. I just want to make sure we.
I'm comfortable with it if
Okay.
that matters.
Sorry.
But in so much as an opinion was expressed here about the waiting period affecting gun shows, I would think that if someone knew that there was a 24-hour waiting period, they would adjust their visitation to the gun show, and if their purpose of going to the gun show would be to buy a gun, they would most likely go on the first day, so it would not be an issue. Not wait till the second day. So that would not affect, for all those people, it would not affect the gun show.
It's just an additional
or
cost.
the viability of the gun show. Only people maybe who had last-minute plans changed and could only make it on the last day. But that I would think would be.
It's just an
minimal
additional cost that is incurred. That's unavoidable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jill Lloyd, just a question about the intent of this is to reduce the suicide rate. You said that there was going to be an evaluation. Will that also, at the end of the year, look at the suicide rate and how many, if it's gone down, the number of cases of death due to a suicide by firearm? It seems like that would be an important thing to be evaluating if that was the intent of it. And secondly, does anyone have in terms of death by firearms, what percentage is, I know it's high.
2/3.
It's 2/3? Okay.
Is suicide.
Two-thirds of suicide.
I'm sorry. I think that what she was asking was of...
Hold on, finish your question.
So yeah, that was my question, is of what percentage of deaths by firearms is due to suicide?
And Wesley,
2/3.
2/3.
Nationally. In Vermont, it's probably in the single digits, or very close to, annually.
What do you mean single digits?
I mean, the amount of people that commit suicide in Vermont every year is probably it's probably
but
less than, it's got to be less than 100. It's got to be maybe even less than 2.
Yeah,
20.
but percentage-wise for population, it would be like, say, if you have 10, if the population is low, which we are, then even if there's a low number of deaths, percentage-wise. I think you have to do the apples to apples.
Statistical analysis and percentages are hard in a state with numbers of crime numbers and suicide numbers as low as ours. Also, I think Vermont is the highest average age of any state in the United States, and that correlates highly with suicide. Older men are the most likely demographic to commit suicide, and the most likely demographic to commit suicide by firearm. Women are most likely to use pharmaceuticals to commit suicide.
But yeah, I am aware that in Vermont it's seniors, men, committing suicide it's a high.
There's also a disturbing trend among Generation Z as well, having a higher suicide rate than their peers. And there's different studies that suggest that maybe the reason for that is social media or something. Never having lived without it, being the first generation never to have lived without constant social media and stuff, but that's a whole other
one thing. Jill, to answer your first question, I do not believe the reporting that you were referring to does ask for rates on suicide, and so I think that
seems
would be,
like that if this is the intent of this bill, that would be an important thing to
I asked some of
evaluate.
these questions already to people on Judiciary Committee, and those data are not really readily available. When you have a suicide death, some of that is covered by privacy and what was the intent, where did the person get the gun. That information is very difficult to put together to know. In X number of cases, they went and they bought a gun and, whatever. But the information isn't really there in one place. That's not the intent of this report, but it was not a satisfying answer I was able to get because you can't collect the information for a whole lot of reasons.
Well, I guess I'm ignorant about this, but if it was suicide by a firearm, it seems like law enforcement would be involved, but I don't know that answer.
It probably involves with all suicides. There's less than 100 in Vermont annually. I just looked it up. It's about 80 total suicides.
Yeah.
And I think about maybe 40% or half are guns.
Yeah, so I'm ignorant about this, but it seems like that would be accessible information.
It seems like a good question to ask of our Judiciary Committee. And I know looks like Bob had a response to the suicide rates.
Yeah, according to an exhaustive VPR study, from 2011 to 2017, there were 433 firearm suicides in Vermont. 153 were carried out with a long gun, 271 with a handgun. Vermont's suicide death rate is 35% higher than the national average, and guns are used 59% of the time. That's according to a CDC report of June 8th of 2018. When South Dakota repealed this 48-hour waiting period for handgun purchases in 2009, overall suicides the following year increased by 7.6%. So, waiting periods have
You've been waiting a long time.
marked impact on.
When you go back to the original intent of this law, which was to limit impulse and to influence impulsive purchase of firearms, then I think it raises a couple questions. One is, I don't think they should, and I'm supportive of that intent. I don't think exceptions for gun shows and things makes any sense. I think you want as broad a reach as you can have. You're only trying to reach people who don't have access to guns through other means, which is unfortunately very possible. And the other has to do with long guns. I think it's inappropriate that it's only limited to handguns. I think it should be extended to long guns as well.
Great. Thank you. Laurel, you had your hand up for a while. I just wanted to...
I just was wondering if anybody knows whether in these states that have the waiting period, I seem to recall that many of them have an exception for gun shows, but I may be wrong. My information may be way out of date, but does anybody have definitive information about whether in the states that require a waiting period, gun shows are exempted?
I don't think so.
Because I thought they were in some of those states, but maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, so that's a good question to ask.
On states that don't have universal background checks, there's no background check, so there's no waiting period, right? But on states, generally states that have waiting periods would also have universal background checks. Maybe not. Florida maybe has like a waiting period, but not universal background checks. So that could apply there in some areas. But anyways, anybody that is a federal firearms license holder has to perform a background check, regardless all the time. I wanted to make a point about suicidality on a broad scale. If you look at it in the whole world, the places with the highest suicide rates have virtually no access or private ownership to guns at all. So I think there's a lot of underlying causes that affect suicidality that are not being addressed at all here. This is one tool used for suicide. It's the majority, but it's a little bit more than half. But like I've already said, among women, it's not the most popular choice, and there's still going to be. Even if you eliminate this option, it doesn't mean they can't then just choose a different option. And as you see, like in places like South Korea and Japan that have astronomically high suicide rates with comparison to the United States and zero private ownership of firearms, there's other underlying causes. You see a lot of correlation regionally and culturally to suicide rates. Seems like places like Bermuda and Bahamas, like gorgeous island paradises, have very, very low suicide rates. But you see a lot of Eastern European countries clump together. You see a lot of Western countries clump together. A lot of Asian countries clump together in regards to their suicide rates. And so I think there's probably cultural causes. This is an issue that can be addressed at the family and friend level. There's mental health causes. I think like 20% of people in the United States have some kind of mental illness annually.
I think that, Wesley, I think your point is well heard. I think that we are not ultimately addressing the challenge we have in this state of heightened rates of suicide, depression, and as a result, drug use, alcohol use, opioids. This bill does not address that. And I think what it does address is the point of sale, which is this last year, I had a friend who lost his brother, jumped off the gorge a couple years ago, and he got drunk by himself and shot himself. And I know if he had waited to the morning, he may not have made that decision. So I think when we give people that time, that hopefully they will make a better decision. So I think part of it is addressing the access, making sure that we're slowing down that time so people are making not such abrupt decisions. Now, if 2 days later they want to jump off the Quechee Gorge,
Well,
so it doesn't address that issue that
that's my point, is that it doesn't really, it affects access to one thing, but I mean, humans, the only way you can actually stop people, you don't even want to imagine what it would take to stop somebody from committing suicide that's dedicated to doing it. You'd basically have to put them in a padded room in a straitjacket.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I don't want to dominate the question. You had a question in the back there.
Ethel Weinberger. I think that this waiting period is not just to address suicide. I think it's in general to address impulse use of firearms. So I don't think we have to be hung up on just the suicide. It could be, somebody who has a grudge. It can be all the places that we know cannot be safe. So I think I think you limit the appeal of this if you limit it just to suicide. I think it is the whole issue of people need to have time before they get a gun to think about what they're using that gun for. If they're using it to go hunting, they have time. They can try to get the gun before. I know that's if it was long guns as well as handguns. But it seems to me that if we're going to take examples of other countries, we can find many other countries where gun legislation that have waiting periods has made a difference. And to my surprise, our neighboring state, New Hampshire, has put in 7-day waiting period.
Well, I guess I was thinking in Section 5, subsection C, where that's the evaluation part that's there.
Yep.
It looks like there is an effort to evaluate the effect of the extreme removal situation on the results of suicide there. So it's saying there, but I'm wondering if that's also a place where perhaps you could put in the effect of it, not just on removing guns from folks that we think are at extreme risk, but what's the effect of any of these things on the suicide rate? Can that just somehow be cobbled into there so we can get the information? If we can get information about the impact of extreme risk, then we should be able to get the impact on other kinds of suicides as well.
I agree. And there's always the issue of correlation versus causation. Did we actually prevent the suicides, or is there just a trend of increased suicides in general?
But it would at least help with this idea of what we imagine is happening and what is happening. It would be lovely to have some data, whichever way it goes.
I agree.
Because we don't know.
I think that makes sense. Wesley, do you mind if I call?
Yeah, go ahead.
I know you were always maybe first.
Heather Staliga. I'm curious about where this particular bill fits into the overall gun laws of Vermont.
I'm going to hand that off to Mr. Bartholomew, Representative Bartholomew.
I can't really answer that because I'm not that familiar with that section of law. I mean, it would take someone from legislative counsel, because when you look at a bill, it just shows the sections where language is changed. So I'm not enough of an expert to really credibly answer that.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Mr. Ring?
I just wanted to make a point that the concept of extreme risk prevention orders, I'm not, or this is more just an opinion, I'm not against them if there's a correct level of burden of proof, because it actually targets people that are at risk for suicide or for other types of crime instead of just everybody, like myself. But I wanted to point out something that somebody else's comment made me think of this, if the intent of this is to stop impulse buying of firearms or access to firearms immediately, somebody that doesn't already have firearms, it also has, it's a double-edged sword, because the other side of that is people that are of sound mind and are legal to own a firearm, that can pass a background check, that need one immediately, can't get one immediately. There's women that have been murdered by their ex because they were waiting for the state's permission to be able to own a firearm. And this has happened in New Jersey. So people that are most at risk, people, public figures, women with, or anybody with an abusive spouse or something like that, or people that have a stalker or a credible threat against them that don't have a firearm already, can't get one, and it's not like they're going to be put into protective custody or have a policeman there all the time to protect them in most cases.
It's definitely an argument that we heard quite a bit on Tuesday. The women in circumstances of domestic violence, because this bill also addresses domestic violence, or the intent of it is the other large contributor of firearms death is domestic violence. So it's something that we're trying to target, and so there's the other side that Wesley has brought up. I don't know enough about the subject to say whether that's accurate or not. I know I've heard that argument.
I can show you specific people later on.
I think Ethel had.
I was just going to respond that I don't believe that organizations that are in support of victims of domestic violence support that particular answer.
David. Thank you.
David Singer. A little historical background on domestic violence. This is not my ego, but I assisted Jerry Martinez. It's a woman, Jerry Martinez, who wrote a lot of the Vermont domestic violence laws. And Jerry made the statement once in front of the legislature that every one of these statutes is a follow-up to a murder of a woman by her spouse or husband. Strangely enough, a lot of that came from, I still can't believe it, driving into cliffs, driving your car full speed into a tree, and not a firearm. So it's more than just firearms. I mean, a little bit of personal history. In my 20 years as a police officer, I went to 8 suicides. Only 3 of those were as a result of firearms, and those firearms were already in possession of the self-inflicted gun carrier. So it's like Mr. Rainey said, it's so hard. We can go to national averages, but Vermont is sort of different. The other thing is most Vermonters have a lot of respect for firearms. That's why I'm finding it a little hard to believe that we're having so many problems. I know drugs is part of it, and that's the end of my speech.
Thank you, David.
You can go on calling him for his
Okay, this back to this bill. This particular bill just makes it a little more inconvenient to buy a firearm. You're going to have to go back a second day to pick it up, which makes it very difficult for a gun show. Couldn't that inconvenience be alleviated considerably if you just allowed, after the background check has taken place, allow the gun to be shipped to the person?
I think that was addressed earlier with the third-party people. The deposits.
Federal law prevents that.
You can't send firearms through the mail?
Nope. Okay. Transfer has to happen in person.
There's very limited circumstances, but a new purchase of firearm, whether it's a long gun or a handgun, always has to the background check and the transfer has to be performed at a federal firearms license holder.
Can I just clarify that?
Yeah.
Can't 2 license holders ship firearms between each other?
Yeah, a license holder is not really like a person, like your average person. But a license holder can.
So they can be shipped. It just has to be the right people.
Right, a federal firearms license holder is essentially a gun shop in a lot of cases.
So
they have to be in the business of selling firearms. You can't have an FFL really just for your own entertainment. The ATF will squash that.
We put up with inconvenience of waiting in all sorts of transactions. You buy a house, you have a mortgage, you go through a process with the bank, you go through a process with the seller. When you order something from Amazon, you wait a couple of days before it arrives at your door. You go to buy a car and it's financed, there's a waiting period involved in that. All of a sudden for firearms, there's this expectation being expressed here that somehow it has to happen right that second. I want it and I'm getting it now. Put up with the inconvenience. I'm not worried about inconveniencing somebody for the 24-hour period or a second trip to the gun show.
Jill had her hand up there.
So, just clarification, what I thought I just heard was that if you have this federal
firearms license.
Yep. So that would be someone at a gun show that they can mail it. Is that
only to another
license?
To another. Okay. All right.
I just want to say about the bill. it's an inconvenience to something that's in the Bill of Rights. It's not an inconvenience to a transaction at a store, or, I'm not willing to have a waiting period to express my religious beliefs or my freedom of speech, or search and seizure, or cruel and unusual punishment. I'm not willing to deal with a waiting period for any of those things as well.
Okay. That's yeah.
But none of those things that were just listed are things that kill people. So guns kill people.
That's arguable.
And for someone who needs, it seems to me, someone who is that insistent that they not wait 24 hours to get a gun.
Cars kill the same amount of people as guns.
And you have to usually wait 24 hours.
There's no
to get
background check for a car.
So I'm going to ask that we continue to stay focused on the bill.
To buy a car.
And opinions about Bill of Rights is a long conversation which we will not resolve today. I promise. So I encourage folks. So I encourage folks, if there are opinions about the Bill of Rights, to discuss outside of this meeting. Right now, we just want to focus on the bill.
Regarding the bill, this may have been discussed before I came in. Was there any discussion of the definition of large capacity ammunition devices? What is that? Where is that? Is that not? That doesn't seem to be defined in the bill. Is there some other definition of that? Not being a gun person, I don't know what the range might be of large capacity versus medium capacity or small.
I probably have the best grasp on that.
It kept changing last year, and I've lost it. It's 10 or 15. I forget now which one.
The definition that the state has passed as of last year is that it's 10 rounds for long guns and 15 rounds for handguns.
And one of the issues with that whole thing and criticism of the bill that's been made and makes a lot of sense is there are no serial numbers. How would you actually prove that it was bought out of state and you imported it, or you already had it, or you gave it to somebody else? It's very difficult. Although the law was used in the case of Kaya Morris, who's the representative from Bennington who was harassed by white supremacists. I don't know if you've been following that story at all. The aggressor in that case was arrested because they documented that he bought one out of state and brought it in. There were videos. So the law was used in that case. Whether so there are ways, but it's a very, very difficult piece of statute to enforce.
I handed out 1,000 of them last year before the law went into effect on the State House lawn.
And that was totally legal.
I know one of your purposes was to get a little bit of a temperature also of the room of what folks thought about the bill in particular, and from what I'm hearing with it, the inconveniences are somewhat minimal. It's not like the world's most powerful bill. It's not something that's going to run up to the Supreme Court as far as I can tell. But I would make a couple of requests around it. I think, one of the questions is this is not the only way that people commit suicide, as we've talked about. So I would be interested in hearing, as things progress, what are some of the other efforts that are happening around suicide prevention beyond this that can impact that issue, if that's one of the issues before us. And the other is, as you are getting studies and other information coming up, any way that you can convey or disseminate that would be helpful for those of us who use studies, whether they're in-state or national or whatever, to help inform us rather than just, sometimes we know people who've had things happen to us and we form a strong opinion that way, but a study is also really helpful in learning some more about it. So if there are studies or other pieces about the effects that come up, those would be very helpful.
Dan, thank you for those requests. I think those are both very valid. I think I've been a little bit frustrated that we haven't seen more legislation addressing suicide rates in the state or opioid addiction.
And the same with domestic abuse.
You know that Hartland residents were really the driving force behind the suicide prevention things that are have been put in at the gorge.
A great effort, right? Exactly.
There are a lot of things that are going on, but the whole mental health issue, that is so extraordinarily difficult. Partly because when you're in a legislature, you're in one committee, so it's hard to keep track of what they're talking about in different committees. But in terms of suicide or violence, I mean, you can't arrest somebody till they've broken a law. So if you have someone who's planning extreme violence, unless you've got proof, they haven't done anything wrong until they commit the violence. And if you have someone who's mentally ill and contemplating suicide, you can't step in unless you know that they're reaching a crisis point. It's very difficult, and dealing with mental health issues in the state is a very elusive and difficult problem.
I am aware of that. I guess what I'm looking at is what do we know about the best methods to get ahead of the curve in these situations, because there are reasons we can't just pull people. We can't say, you look like somebody's going to commit domestic violence, let's chuck you in jail. We can't do that. But what are the things that we can learn about the signs, the prevention pieces that are there in other areas, both for both of those? It's just a request as we learn more about that, please disseminate.
I agree completely, and just because things are difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do our best to try to address them. And John's points are absolutely valid. Unfortunately, we have a short session, and I wish we could stay there longer, although it would be at the expense of taxpayer money to pay us to be there. So I don't know if you'd want us there much longer, but I agree we should address this. And just to be clear, the second thing you asked for was that you would like us to convey documentation and surveys and reports having to do with this.
Research.
Is the listserv an adequate spot? Is everybody here on the listserv? Also, if you, my business cards are right over there. If you want to send those requests directly to my alleged email, I'd be happy to make sure I follow up with you too. Wes, yeah.
Well, yeah, Chris's comment, I have similar concerns in that I don't feel that this bill addresses the root causes of suicide. I think that it's largely motivated by anti-gun animus, and it's the very end of the chain of events that lead to suicide, and I'd much rather see effort being put towards mental health and other programs to try to prevent it earlier on. Much as last year with all the other anti-gun laws that were passed in Vermont, the excuse for passing them was the planned school shooting by that student, and then no bills were passed to address school security. The governor made some funds available, but I have children in school. There was no laws passed to actually do anything with the schools physically. No training, no infrastructure changes, and nothing on mental health. It was just go after guns of people like me, and it's adversely affect my business.
Are you in the retail business?
I'm a firearms instructor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Any other comments?
I'd like to share.
I think the bill is basically like a seatbelt.
Yeah.
Seatbelts don't save all lives in car accidents. Drunk driving laws don't end people drinking more than they should and taking to the road. But it sets a reasonable standard. A waiting period isn't going to stop all suicides, but we see from the other states that it does bring down the suicide.
You can't, that has not been, all the factors have not been taken into account there. The highest correlation to suicide is sex and age. And there's demographic effects. Possession of firearms has very low correlation to suicide.
Okay. I'm not sure if anyone in this room really has, I certainly don't have the credentials to talk about what motivates people to suicide and what kind of suicide prevention techniques work. I don't know if anyone in the room has the credentials and the data to really back up anything. But I'd like to share, if I may, some testimony that I hear about this testimony all the time when I talk to people in the House Judiciary, and it came from Rebecca Bell, who is a physician, pediatric critical care at UVM Children's Hospital, and is quite an authority. I can't give you her total credentials and why she's an expert in suicide because I didn't hear the testimony directly, but I'd just like to go through some of the things in this because the Judiciary Committee's using these data or this information a lot in putting this together. And what she had to say is Vermont has a higher than average rate of suicide deaths. Our rate of youth suicide deaths is consistently placed in the top quartile in the U.S. Means matter. Among all age groups, firearms are the most common method used in suicide death in Vermont. In the 18 and younger age group, about half of the suicide deaths are due to firearms. Vermont has higher than average youth-sized suicide death rate when compared to other states. but lower than average prevalence rate of youth reporting severe depressive symptoms, suicide planning, and suicide attempts. So death rate is higher than the depression. That's how I read that. Differences across states in the rate of suicide deaths are largely explained by variations in household gun ownership. 90% of those who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to later die by suicide. 90% who weren't successful first time. Many suicide attempts occur with little planning during a short-term crisis. Adolescent and young adult survivors of nearly lethal suicide attempts were asked how much time elapsed from the moment they decided to attempt suicide to when the attempt occurred. 24% said less than 5 minutes, and an additional 50% said less than an hour. So impulse is important. Those who attempt suicide impulsively are more likely to choose a violent method and are less likely to have a history of depression than those who use other methods. Firearms are the most lethal means of suicide. Only over 90% of firearm suicide attempts result in death. Restriction of highly lethal means can lead to fewer suicide deaths due to delay or substitution of less lethal means. The EPR report looked at death certificates of firearm suicides in Vermont from 2011 to 2016, show 60% used handguns, that's 234, and 36 used long guns. So she went on to say, no single intervention will solve the problem of gun violence. However, requirement of a waiting period to purchase firearms help to address the proven connection between impulsivity, access to firearms, and suicide. The link between impulsivity, access to firearms, temporary crisis, and suicide death are well described in the medical literature. National physician organizations have reported on this link and recommend enacting waiting periods to guard against impulsive acts, including American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Physicians, and the American Medical Association. So I hear about Dr. Bell's testimony quite a bit around the State House, and that was the basis for how they came up with this.
I want to tell everybody I really appreciate how much, how we could have this conversation. I think that oftentimes we're dominated by national talking points, and a lot of those are never meant to be solved. It's meant to be divisive. But I think everybody here cares about this issue to some extent or another, and that when we talk and work together as a community, we can create stronger legislation for our state, which actually addresses the issues. I think I've learned some things today. I hope others have as well. And I think there's ways that we can make this bill stronger to actually address those issues, and looked at ways that maybe some things are redundant. So I encourage you all to continue to have these conversations between yourselves and your neighbors, and to continue to stay in touch with John and I about these issues, as well as your senators, Alice Nitka, Allison Clarkson, and Dick McCormick, to express your points of view, because that helps us vote and make the best decisions possible. And ultimately, nobody wins when there's false information out there, which was my primary objective in bringing you here today, so that we could look through the bill line by line and make sure that we're getting ahead of anything that's going to come out that'll falsify the information. So I really appreciate you all. I appreciate this community, and I appreciate the opportunity to get together and speak with you more, and I wish we could do it more. So I don't want to cut off conversation, but I am feeling very grateful for my community today. So,
thank you for organizing the meeting.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, with that, let's all have a nice night.